Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. And I think that we will start. People will slowly be coming in. We are going to have now what is called an Oxford debate on the TTIP, or TTIP, but let's call it TTIP. And the motion is TTIP is contrary to EU interests. It's a very few words as a matter of introduction. You know that the TTIP is probably the most controversial trade agreement the EU has ever negotiated, and also the most followed agreement. When the EU has been negotiating Korea, Canada, India, other important agreements, nobody was interested. Only the interested parties. But the public, forget it. Today we have a very strong opposition in the European Union. When you look at the website that is called stop-ttip.org, you realize that very recently they have handed 3,284,289 signatures to the President of the European Parliament. In parallel with TTIP, and it's important also, I think, for the debate, are going on other negotiations that have an influence on the EU, especially the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that is coming at this moment to an end. The negotiations started in 2013. And immediately there was a position from the industry that has been in favor of a comprehensive agreement, and the position from the opposition that said we don't need it, we should not have it for many different reasons. And I'm not going to go through the reasons because obviously I would take the ammunition from the participants. Let me introduce the participants, and then I will give you the rules of the game. We have on my left side Gabriel Siles-Brugge, who is the extreme left, who is a lecturer in politics of the University of. I am not saying that we are politically on the extreme left. I said extreme left. Lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester. Then we have Martin Korolec, a former Minister of Environment of Poland, who is going to oppose the TTIP with the motion, which means that he is going to speak in favor of TTIP. The next one we have Eric Morris, who is editor-in-chief of EU Observer. And I have to tell you that Eric stepped in at the last moment because we have only 3 participants. So I was running around to try to find somebody who would be willing to support the motion and to speak against the TTIP. It doesn't mean whether Eric is or is not in favor of the TTIP, or he believes it is or it is not good for the EU. His task is today to convince you that the TTIP is against the interest of the EU. And then we have Nicholas Hodač, who is a government affairs senior executive of IBM from Brussels, and who will also speak against the motion, which means in favor of the TTIP. Again, the motion is TTIP is contrary to the EU interest. The rules of the game are the following. Each of the participants has 4 minutes to present his case. And we will have 4 against, 4 and against. And after those 16 or maybe a little bit more minutes, but please not much more, I will open the discussion to the audience. You have the possibility through your laptops to ask questions and to vote. The voting will be open after the initial statements from the panelists. And then, obviously, you can direct the questions to the panelists. You don't have to do it through the media, through the slide. You can do it directly. We don't need a mic. I don't know if there is a mic in the room. There is a mic in the room. Okay, so we have a mic in the room. So we can do it also in direct questions. And at the end of the day, we are going to see who won the debate. It doesn't mean that the TTIP is good or bad or in or against the interests of the EU. We have the question is of a Oxford debate. So, without any further ado, everybody is clear about the rules. Eric, again, thank you very much for stepping in on such a very short notice. But Gabriel, this word is yours. Don't forget what you are supposed to do.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I actually do stand for the views I'm going to be representing today, so you can hold me accountable for what I say today. So I'm going to argue that TTIP is contrary to EU interests as it's currently being formulated, because there's not much to gain and there's actually something to lose. So on the first point, there's not much to gain. So advocates of TTIP put forward two main reasons as to why TTIP is something desirable, something we should strive for. The first is that TTIP is a source of growth and jobs for the European Union at a time of austerity, right? It's a free source of growth and jobs. As Karel de Gucht used to say, it's the cheapest stimulus package you can imagine, right? And in defense of that, the Commission put forward a series of figures back in 2013, saying that TTIP would result in gains to the average EU family of 545 euros each family, right? So if you boil that down, actually, not that much, about €2.50 per person per week, right? Which I think in Prague might buy you 1.5 beers, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe a cup of coffee per person per week elsewhere in the EU, so it's not much. And actually it also exaggerates, this figure exaggerates the extent to which TTIP will actually boost growth and jobs, because it's based on the assumption that TTIP will eliminate half of the existing non-tariff barriers to trade between the EU and the US, right? So best case scenario, an extra cup of coffee or an extra pilsner per person per week, but that is unlikely to materialize, because getting rid of half of the NTBs between the EU and the US, as we've seen with these negotiations, ain't going to happen. So the second argument that advocates put forward, given that this economic argument is somewhat weak, is that they say, well, TTIP is also a chance for the EU and the US to set the standards for the global economy, right? Given the rise of China, our market power as the EU and the US is only going to diminish, and now is our chance to, capitalize on that and to come together and come up with common standards that everyone else in the world will have to adopt. To cut a long story short, myself, I don't think that's a very credible story, because that would work maybe if the EU and the US were thinking about harmonizing their standards, because that would give third country producers an incentive to adopt that harmonized or common EU-US standard. But actually what's on the table is a more limited form of regulatory cooperation called mutual recognition. And on top of that, it's if you look at the detail of the Commission documents, the discussion is about bilateral mutual recognition. So third country exporters would not benefit from the mutual recognition between the EU and the US markets. And so they have little incentive to push their governments to adopt a standard, because the status quo would prevail for them, right? So no global standards. So what is TTIP actually about? And this is where I stress what there is to lose. TTIP is ultimately about cutting red tape for big business. It's about eliminating a whole host of social and environmental protections that represent a cost to business, and actually slowing down public policy making in the public interest, where this might actually represent additional costs to businesses. And this isn't just about ISDS, which has been much criticized, right, the Investors in State Dispute Settlement mechanism, but it's actually about bringing in deregulation in a much more subtle way via the back door, via a series of cross-cutting horizontal regulatory provisions, which would entail provisions on something called regulatory coherence, which is about making regulation better, but it's actually a chance of giving stakeholders early information on regulatory measures, allowing stakeholders, which are largely business groups, of course, early input into the regulatory process, and strengthening the role of impact assessments in decision making, and particularly impact assessments that take into account the impact that policy measures may have on transatlantic trade. So it's not actually about improving regulation, it's about reducing regulation. Secondly, there's a series of cross-cutting provisions that are being proposed also on regulatory cooperation. So, increasing cooperation between EU and US regulators. And that in and of itself wouldn't be such a bad thing, but the problem is, it's being conducted within the context of a trade agreement. And the aim of a trade agreement is to reduce barriers to trade rather than make regulation better when it comes to protecting the environment and social affairs. So, to sum up, I think actually with TTIP what you have is a danger that some of the important achievements that were arrived at as a result of the single market, achievements in terms of harmonizing standards upwards in areas of environmental policy, but also in social policy, might be undermined through this drive towards eliminating transatlantic so-called non-tariff barriers.
Thank you very much. Martin?
Thank you. Just to present myself, I was Environment Minister for 2 years, but I was also Trade Minister for 6 years, and that's why I asked the privilege to take part of this panel. And I like your first sentence saying, I am not for TTIP as it is now. And it is a good sentence for the start, because we do not have an end result now. So anyhow, the end game, end result will be different from what we have now on the table. And we have, in fact, a lot of noises, a lot of public statements, comments, declarations, practically every day in the press or internet we have pro and contrary. President of one country saying France is not yet ready. Chancellor of another state is saying let's do that quickly and together. Phil Hogan, Commissioner for Agriculture, is saying one thing. President of milk producers from the US is saying another thing. All in all, my understanding is those are guidelines, those are hints, those are way of helping negotiators how to land properly with the end result. And thinking about today's meeting, I was asking myself, for whom is that agreement? And you said it is for the big corporations. Actually, I'm working for one US big corporation those days after leaving administration, and I can tell you that those big corporations don't need that. They have lawyers, they have lobbyists, they have money. They will manage. Oh, they are managing now. In my understanding, this agreement is for citizens first, and this agreement is second for small and medium-sized enterprises. And I would say even more for European citizens than for US citizens. If we see not non-tariff barriers, but this is another issue. But if we see duties, level of duties, EU duties comparing to US duties are all bigger, higher. We have extreme cases in with motor vehicles and with processed food. And you said the delivery of this TTIP will be 1 cup of coffee or 2 beers for maybe, if you can, that way. But if I will buy a Tesla for $35,000 US dollars, I will earn with TTIP practically $3,000. So it is not a cup of coffee, it is a good, probably very good car, and $3,000 US dollars for me personally is a lot of money. So I think worth to think about it. When I saying this TTIP is for small and medium-sized enterprises, I'm looking for the Polish case and the case of Polish membership into European Union. In case of Polish exports, for the time of membership into European Union, we started with our export around 40 billion US dollars yearly. Today we have 160 billion US dollars yearly, so 400%. In the case of Czech Republic, I checked yesterday the data, it is double of export. So if you compare 500 million Europeans and more than 318 million US citizens, I think it is comparable because they are richer. And it is the biggest middle class in the world. So in 10 years from now, probably is a similar, and I share what de Gucht said, you're quoting, it is a similar stimulus for our economies in terms in terms of export. So I will stop maybe here for the while. I think this agreement is basically for citizens and for medium and small enterprises because it is expanding a room for the trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric.
So it's my turn now. I have to say,
Yes, it is your turn.
yeah, I accepted the challenge of becoming a staunch and convincing opponent of TTIP in 20 minutes. So I probably will use some arguments which are based on unchecked facts. But then, when you look at a certain debate these days in one country, it's maybe the best solution to win the argument. So I will go into that way. I would say that you have to look at not only the economical pros and cons of TTIP, but also the situation between the US and the EU, and also where these two entities start from in the negotiation. And I would go back to the words of President Obama himself when the Trans-Pacific partnership was concluded a few months ago. And Obama said that was necessary for the US to have this agreement with Pacific countries, especially China, because the US needed to set the rules of world trade. And we also know that for the US, that agreement, that Trans-Pacific agreement, is the basis on which they want to negotiate the TTIP with the Europeans. So, in terms of interest for the EU, are we ready to accept an agreement which the US sees as a way of setting the rules in world trade? Would that be our interest? We have to remind ourselves that the EU is the biggest internal and consumer market in the world. It is more important than the US market. So do we need to apply to our market rules that the US would like to impose on us? Another thing is that for the EU, another agreement is the basis for the negotiation. It's the CETA agreement with Canada. But when we look at what the US is asking for Europe, what the EU achieved with Canada at the end of the negotiation is the starting point for the Americans. So that means that what we spent a long time to negotiate will not be negotiable with the US. And if we want to rush to a conclusion of TTIP before the end of the year, we have to ask ourselves, what are we ready to accept in a short time? And what are we ready to block, to refuse, with the risk of not achieving the TTIP? And we saw when Obama came to Europe a few weeks ago that, of course, he was pushing for the agreement. But Chancellor Merkel also was pushing for the agreement, and also we have to see who is negotiating for Europe. It is the European Commission. And if there is one thing that the European Commission hates to do is to admit failure, to stop a process instead of going to the end of it for the sake of it. So should we trust the Commission to reach an agreement which would be in the interest of the EU when this institution is known to try to reach agreements whatever the cost is, and we know that the process has not been as transparent as we could wish. We know that there is a lot of political pressure to end it quickly. So that is the big question, without going into the details, that we have to question the way the agreement is being negotiated right now. And just a point also about the EU-Canada agreement. It was negotiated by the federal government of Canada, but also involving the provinces and local powers in Canada, which is not the case in the US. It is only the federal state which is negotiating. And we know that in terms of regulation, of setting standards, the internal market of the US is not a single market as in the EU. So if we reach an agreement between the federal state and the EU, we will then have to face the different norms, standards in the different states of the US. So do we want to rush into that without being sure of what we will achieve in terms of standards, in terms of food, of car makings, and other essential, crucial sectors for Europe? So I will stop there for now, but that's my quick thoughts about the topic.
Thank you very much. Nicolas?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and Eric and Gabriel for making the case against TTIP. And I actually agree and support with a number of things that you have said, and it comes back to what Martin has said. I strongly believe that TTIP is in the interests of the EU, but it all depends on the type of TTIP. First of all, Eric, I am convinced that there is no way that a bad agreement can pass the European Council and the European Parliament. Because this is not the EU-South Korea negotiations, these are not the EU-Vietnam negotiations, these are not those negotiations. The level of discussion that is taking place, and me being engaged, in Brussels with the European Parliament on a daily basis, the Parliament and member states and NGOs are watching this so closely that there might have been a time when indeed you could not have trusted the Commission because they negotiate things in secret. This is not the case anymore. Yes, obviously parts of the negotiations are still in secret and you have these reading rooms. I mean, that's the nature of negotiations. But at the end of the day, the result will be transparent, will be public, and I am convinced that a bad agreement will not pass the European Parliament and the European Council. Because I am also sure that business will not want to support a bad agreement. Because it's not in the interest of business to support an agreement which will not set the template for other agreements. You have a point on what you said also about CETA, and the provinces came to the table on public procurement, etc. And indeed, that is one of the big challenges with TTIP. I mean, that it is extremely difficult, almost impossible for the US to bring on board states. But this goes back to the type of agreement that we will negotiate. Will we manage to negotiate the level of ambition that we had set ourselves out in the very beginning? I don't think so. I believe that the European Commission and the European Union was maybe too ambitious, and that what we are seeing now is a much more realistic discussion. And that's why I am more convinced about this being a good TTIP in the interests of the EU citizens, because it is going to be a much more realistic TTIP. Gabriel, you mentioned the ECORIS study and other studies. I mean, IBM is a member of AmCham EU, the American Chamber of Commerce to the EU, and we had commissioned the study. And I'll just give you some figures and there are 10,000 studies out there, but we had commissioned a study done by the World Trade Institute, which we published a few months ago. And it shows again that there is going to be GDP increase on average 0.5%, that there is going to be a wage increase up to 1.4 to 1.5%. In the Visegrad 4, it's a 0.5% wage increase, high-skilled and low-skilled. So this is for everybody. There will be a consumer price decrease. Although we are talking about 0.1 to 0.3%, so it's not huge, but it is a decrease. And there will be an export increase. So the study that was published by the WTI, the World Trade Institute, does show that TTIP is in the interests of the EU because it shows that there will be clear economic gains. Going now to the regulatory cooperation, and Martin spoke about the SMEs. 99% of businesses in Europe are SMEs. We made a survey, and from those 99%, already a large part export to the US, more than 3/4. And the problem is that all of these SMEs face barriers, double certification, double testing, additional administration. We mentioned the tariffs before, etc. It is much more complicated for an SME to adjust and to absorb the cost than it is for the big businesses, as was mentioned. And so I strongly believe that the regulatory cooperation is of huge added value for all those companies out there that want to export in a more efficient way so that they can use that money to then innovate and invest. So the money that you are spending on doing double testing and double certification, you can use it here in Europe to invest back into the European economy, into innovation, etc. Just to give you an example on regulatory cooperation, take the digital sector, for instance. It is true that in certain areas of the digital economy, the US and US companies have been leading the way, social media, etc., Google, Facebook. But Europe has a huge strength, which is in the Internet of Things, industrial manufacturing, e-health. IBM has announced 5 months ago that we are actually opening our global headquarters for Internet of Things here in Europe, in Germany, in Munich. Because we believe in the potential of Europe. Now, what do we want to do? Like any other SME, we want to be able to export those solutions. And that's where regulatory cooperation comes into play, to make it easier for us to export those solutions and to SMEs to export the products without lowering standards. There is no one in the business community that is actually asking for a lowering of environmental standards or a lowering of consumer standards, etc. That is not what people are asking for. And again, it is something that never the European Commission or the US government would accept. And in any of the texts that are available, I have not seen anything that actually shows that there is an actual lowering of standard. Regulatory cooperation doesn't mean deregulation and doesn't mean an opportunity for governments not to have the power of regulation anymore. It is about cooperation, making sure that like in a sector like ours, in the digital industry where Europe has a big strength, that we can make sure that going forward, it's a living agreement with regulatory cooperation so that on new standards, on new regulations, we come together at an early stage. So yes, we try and do mutual recognition of functional equivalence in existing standards, there where possible, and the car industry is a good example. We are not going to mutually recognize everything. We are doing this in a proper way with studies, etc., to assess, to make sure that the outcome is the same. But in new standards, in new regulations, making sure that we cooperate together at an early stage, but at the end of the day, the European Commission and European Parliament and Congress and the US administration can still decide whatever they want. And they will do so. So, I think from that perspective, the fact that TTIP will give an opportunity to work together on new rules going forward, will create that framework, is very much in the interest of the EU and of its businesses. And as said, a company like IBM, it will allow us to export solutions that we will be building here in Europe with the European ecosystem to the US. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicolas. Thank you, everybody. Now, you have the chance to vote if you have your computers. And you have the chance to ask questions via the computers. I see them here through the Slido.com, so please go ahead with it. But I would like to ask now the panelists to go back again, and each of them 2 minutes, 3 minutes maximum, to react on what the other side said. So, Gabriel, we start with you. To repeat, we have been talking a lot about regulatory aspects, about benefits to the citizens, to the big companies, to the SMEs. What does it mean? What kind of agreement? And Martin was clearly saying that if he would like to buy a Tesla, which would be a great car, he would gain on it about 3,000 euros.
If only all of us could buy a Tesla Roadster in the region of, I think it's $150,000. But no, let me start on the issue of SMEs. It's interesting. This is the new sort of discourse brought forward to defend TTIP. What I would say here is a couple of things. One, actually a number of SME organizations have come out fairly lukewarm in their support for TTIP, in the sense that they feel that a lot of the advantages are actually going to accrue to big businesses. insofar as it is mostly big businesses that are engaged in transatlantic trade. And actually, you know, a number of SMEs are very concerned about ISDS provisions, which of course are provisions that are very difficult for SMEs to use given the prohibitive costs of hiring lawyers and having long drawn out arbitration cases. And my question would also be, how many of SMEs actually export? I mean, I think, you know, some statistics have flown around, but I think it's actually a much smaller number. You know, what interest does your corner shop around the, you know, have in exporting, right, or your local hairdresser? You know, and SMEs increasingly mostly means M rather than S, right? In my opinion, which can be quite big companies. I think Marjan alluded to the benefits to citizens from TTIP. I think what he meant was the benefits to consumers from lower prices. And this is actually something that consumer organizations themselves talk about. They do talk about TTIP potentially being beneficial because it brings lower prices. But those same consumer organizations have actually been very, very critical on TTIP because they say, well, any gains that we might have in terms of lower prices may well be offset by losses in reductions in standards. You know, the big consumer organization at the European level, BEUC, has been very critical about ISDS, about regulatory cooperation, about regulatory coherence at the heart of TTIP. And, you know, I think that should give us pause for thought. And finally, on the issue of regulatory cooperation, I think Nicholas is right to suggest that, you know, formally speaking, you're not actually changing the legislative process, although the Commission initially, in its initial position paper for the cross-cutting regulatory chapter, had stipulated that it wanted to include a provision that would allow for the sectoral annexes on regulation in TTIP to be amended without domestic ratification. That was ultimately gotten rid of, but it sort of shows the sort of intentions behind the drafters of these provisions. So while that provision may have been eliminated, what's left in TTIP is a process whereby subtle deregulatory pressures are put on policymakers at the agenda setting stage. So just to give you two examples of deregulation that's already happened merely because the TTIP and CETA negotiations have been ongoing. One is the Fuel Quality Directive, which was watered down to exclude oil and fuel from the tar sands from the list of dirty fuels in response to US and in particular Canadian pressure because of the ongoing CETA and TTIP negotiations. And secondly, the legislation on pesticides at the EU level, which was shelved by the Commission recently for a couple of years because of pressure from the US side. And this is sort of legislation to protect against chemicals that have an impact on the endocrine system, right? So endocrine disrupting chemicals. So the subtle deregulatory pressures are, of course, very difficult to chart, but we have already two examples here that show that this is at work. And so while formally the legislative process may stay in place, you know, if at the agenda setting stage you've already thrown a spanner in the works of regulating in the public interest, it doesn't really matter much.
Thank you very much, Marcin.
Thinking about Tesla, I was thinking about Tesla 3, not Tesla. So $35,000, not $70,000.
Still.
3 points. Secrecy. As a long working civil servant in my past life, I was negotiating Services Directive, patent, EU legislation, some trade deals, and also part of the EU climate policy. And I think that negotiations required calm and room for negotiators. The end result is to be open, judged, and implement with all necessary procedures via parliament, national parliaments, council, etc. But if negotiators don't have a room and time for room for pure negotiations, then we have simply a situation when those who are crying most are winning. So this is about secrecy. Second, SME again. You said TTIP is not for SME because a local hairdresser is probably not very much interested. Probably not. But small and medium-sized technological companies to have an access for the US market, I would think they can have appetite to have it. And third, this issue of secret ISDS and mystery of ISDS. Already today, Poland, Czech Republic, other countries, we have dozens of similar agreements with similar settlement of dispute settlement mechanisms. So, and we are surviving. So it is not extremely new. We have such a similar agreements under named bilateral investment treaties with the US, with Canada, with other countries, with also other member states, because from our time of our transformation from 90s, we have with France, with Germany, parallelly to EU legislation, by the way. So those 3 points to answer.
Thank you very much, Eric.
I would like to point out some figures given by Nicolas about the increase of GDP and of wages. You said also that talks were very ambitious at the start and now are becoming more realistic. So when you give these figures, which are the main argument for the larger public to support TTIP and to explain what would be the concrete advantage and interest for Europeans, not only for business but for European citizens and workers, of which agreement are you talking about? Yeah. Because we are still at the technical level of discussions. We don't know yet what will be achieved. We know that between negotiators, the discussions in 3 years have not really gone forward. So what does realistic mean now? And the calculation that you shared with us, are they still relevant? In the end of this difficult process, are we sure that the advantages, the interest will be as even half a point of GDP is fine, but it's not a golden new era between the US and the EU. So I'm very curious to see on what perspective you base your argumentation on. What are the benefits of this talk? Yeah, that would be my only point, very narrow.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Thank you very much. No, that's a very good point, and that's why industry also, and this is not just on trade agreements, but generally speaking on regulation, etc. We always feel that there should be an impact assessment before, and there should be an impact assessment when the deal is signed. Because indeed, you need to make sure that the deal still delivers on the benefits, or at least on some benefits, as you had set out. And the same is on regulation. When the Commission proposes something, it makes an impact assessment, and it assumes certain benefits. Then when it goes to the European institutions, we suddenly have a completely different regulation. And industry always says, well, let's have another impact assessment before ratifying it to make sure that it's still. So I agree with you. I mean, the assumptions that we have, that WTI has made, is obviously based on, an ambitious agreement. I do not dispute that the discussions that we are currently having are pointing into a slightly different direction. And this is why we also believe that if it is not an ambitious agreement, and therefore unlikely that some of these economic benefits can be met, that we should, support the agreement. So that is for me, I believe we are on the same page there, but I want to pass judgment at the end of the road instead of passing judgment on that now. SMEs are concerned about ISDS, and everybody's been talking about ISDS a lot. In the meantime, it has been changed, and it's an investment court system. Commissioner Malmström has listened. She has listened extensively to the to civil society, and has made a lot of changes to the investment court system, including an appeal tribunal also. Now, whether or not the investment court system, as she has suggested, will eventually end up in TTIP is a different story. Obviously, the Americans, with their model bid, have a slightly differences, but the reality is that actually, I think about on 80% of it, us have similarities. The US government has never lost a case that brought against itself. So it shows that their system works. So the fears about the right to regulate, you know, if you put it in the US context, you know, it's something that you need to look at. But, you know, a lot of it has been taken on board. And you know what? The fact that industry, European industry, so Business Europe, the employer federation, European Employer Federation, is in Brussels opposing itself to this investment court system as suggested. If I would be the consumer organizations, etc., must show that there is something in there that business doesn't like and that the consumers should like. So I don't understand why, you know, the consumer organizations and the NGOs are still so much opposed to this when the European business industry, because it's not the American business industry, it's the European business industry, is so vocal against the investment court system. And then a final small statistic on what was said about the SMEs. Think about eBay, and this goes back to what Martin has been saying. On eBay, there is a 55% survival rate for SMEs online compared to offline, a 24% survival rate. 80% of the businesses on eBay export to more than 5 countries. The fact that through trade agreements, whether it is with the US or with other agreements, they can continue exporting beyond the EU to a market of several tens of other millions of people is for me again another testimony of why for a particular sector of the economy using digital tools, TTIP can be so beneficial because it will have a chapter to promote this exchange of information and this transfer of data.
Okay, thank you very much. I will go now to some of the questions, and then I will ask you if you have any other questions, because some of you don't have iPads or computers. There's a question that goes a little bit beyond the economic aspects of the TTIP. Obviously, it does have to make an economic sense. But the question is, it is not only trade and investment, it is also part of a strategic and framework of the West going beyond economy. Can you make a case that this is in fact not true? This doesn't make sense for the EU and for the US, or on the other side, that this is correct and that the TTIP is in fact a part of more global, what I would say, more global picture, and the cooperation, traditional cooperation and relation between the United States and Europe. We'll start with you, Nicholas, now to oppose it. The opposing is no, makes no sense. Thank you.
We firmly believe that a stronger cooperation between the EU and the US through TTIP will have a significant influence on the global economy. Taking a few examples, China and Russia in the digital industry. Both are introducing several measures on localization. Requiring localization of data, the uses of local content requirements, purchasing what the Chinese call secure and controllable products and software for their insurance companies and for their banking industry. The EU and the US partnered at the WTO to oppose this. Following this partnership, the Chinese delayed the introduction. It shows that if the EU and the US can work together in partnership, they can have an influence on what happens in the rest of the world. And I am concerned that if we cannot deliver on an ambitious TTIP, we will be hurting the transatlantic relationship in such a way that it will give an opportunity to the Chinese and to the Russians and others and to the Indians to start proposing their standards. The Internet of Things is a very good example. We have suggested that on the Internet of Things, the EU and the US cooperate on developing global standards, and I am convinced that once the EU and the US can develop their standards on the Internet of Things in terms of security, in terms of privacy, it will set the template for standards that the Chinese, the Indians, and others will have to adopt.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Well, I have a problem with the coherence of the argument. Because on one hand, we hear that TTIP is crucial because the trade is very important between the US and the EU, and we have this community, transatlantic community. But if business is already important without all these agreements bilateral, why do we need it? Then if we are a united community in terms of political, strategic, or economical or trade relations, why do we have so different standards that we need now to make closer? So either it works now and I don't see why we should change it, either it doesn't, and you have to explain why the trade is so important. And I understand the point of having a strengthening of this transatlantic community facing China, facing Russia. But then again, the TTIP is just a bilateral agreement, which is only between the US and the EU, which doesn't address the challenges of China and Russia. So I think instead of losing time, energy, and maybe a quality of our trade by changing standards, we should work together as this big trade and economy power to change the rules multilaterally. Mm-hmm. And we should be more inspired to work in global institutions like the World Trade Organization instead of just speaking one to the other. Yeah. And that doesn't change Russia and China's approach to trade, just negotiating TTIP. And then we would face the same problems after. So I think we are just taking the problem from the wrong side, from the opposite side. We should go to the World Trade Organization and say, we, the US, we, the EU, have a common position to set rules together instead of just talking to each other and excluding China and Russia from the discussions.
Thank you very much. Martin?
Just one remark that the universal WTO agreement just failed, so that's why we have number of bilateral trades agreement. And I think we can ask who is not necessarily happy with the fact that both biggest economies in the world, EU and US, are thinking about closer cooperation and strengthening the prosperity on two sides of the Atlantic. Which of our international partners is not happy with that? And looking at the internet, I saw a number of negative voices, but practically same repeating 3, 4, 5 arguments again and again. And I think it is not by chance, it's just somehow helped. And also the fact that this publication of Greenpeace was so big scandal, because I think there's some help behind that, probably. And let's think about this question of lowering environmental standards. So by TTIP, there is a suggestion that the US companies will force European countries to introduce fracking. Purely nonsense. That will not happen, and that is not on the table. So I think let's think about really close cooperation between two biggest economies, two OECD members, two a group of countries having highest possible legal standards and rules of the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel.
Yeah, so I mean, this geostrategic, geoeconomic question, I mean, if anything, what the TTIP negotiations have shown is that US interests really lie elsewhere. It's really the EU that's been the demandeur of the talks. The US has been much more concerned about its negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I don't think that has necessarily changed because of TTIP, right? The pivot to Asia is in full swing. But beyond that, as I think I briefly mentioned in my opening salvo, the point here is not to set global standards. The point here is to reduce costs to transatlantic trade to help big businesses. And the best way to do that, the least politically costly way of doing so, is via a form of discriminatory mutual recognition that third countries can't benefit from. And this is explicitly recognized in the Commission's impact assessment, if you read the footnotes. And of course, if you have a mutual recognition of standards that's bilateral, so only EU and US companies benefit, then that, of course, it doesn't give third parties an incentive to adopt those standards. Moreover, unlike TPP, which has an explicit mechanism for third countries to join, TTIP, there's all these, this academic work that suggests, TTIP could be multilateralized. I fail to see how. There's no explicit provision for multilateralizing TTIP. And it's explicitly not meant to be multilateralized. It's a way of bypassing, I think as Martian said, the multilateral system. And for that reason, I don't think there's a huge geoeconomic benefit. To make it a little bit more concrete, one of the big concerns these days is energy dependence, particularly on Russia. And this, of course, is an issue, but the argument put forward is that TTIP is the solution insofar as it's a way of importing cheap shale gas from the United States, right? Because currently the United States doesn't export shale gas. You need to have an FTA with the United States. It all sounds good and dandy, fine and dandy, until you realize that actually Europe doesn't really have the infrastructure in place to import shale gas. So actually what Europe should be doing is investing in renewable energy if it wants to wean itself off Russian gas, and instead it's sort of putting all its eggs in the TTIP basket, which I think is quite problematic.
Thank you very much. I would like to rephrase the question because I think that the question means something else. There are economic interests, and the TTIP is about economy, about economic relations. And when you talk about standards, it still falls into the field of economic relations. Now the question is whether it goes beyond the economic relations, beyond economy. Does it have an influence, a successful TTIP, a conclusion of TTIP? Does it improve the relations between the United States and Europe in other areas, military, etc.?
I think, we, in other areas, we have seen...
or can it hurt?
We have seen in a number of areas, and I'll stick to the one I know the best, the digital area, and that has been a very big tension between the EU and the US over the last 2 years, and we believe that TTIP, from that perspective, can help improve that relationship again and build that trust. There is a lack of trust between the EU and the US on a number of areas, and the failure of the agreement, we believe will further damage the trust and move both to a different path. We talk a lot about the famous pivot to Asia, and Obama's speech, and he did conclude a very big agreement with TPP. But it's still not going. It's still not through Congress. But the EU and the US. In digital, the EU is by far the largest exporter of digital services in the world, larger than the US. It's in the interest of the EU to work with the Americans so that together they can develop those global standards.
Eric, a quick answer.
I had an idea, but I forgot it.
Good.
Yeah, because I was kind of agreeing with you actually. Yeah.
You can also repeat what I said.
No. I just took notes and I forgot what I wanted to say. But what I was thinking also is No, I forgot, sorry.
Okay, doesn't matter. We'll come back to it. Marcin?
I think as a result, TTIP is more than trade. Is in fact the community of 800 million citizens. As a result, not in a text, but as a having the free trade zone may have and will have political consequences for both part of this agreement. Presumably common some new ideas and some new initiatives.
Gabriel?
Yeah, so, I mean, okay, you asked a more specific question about geopolitics, right? So let me come to that. Does TTIP have benefits in terms of strengthening the political? I mean, I'm a political economist, so I hesitate to separate the political from the economic. But does TTIP have political benefits? And I would say, actually, you know, if you look at the current state of the negotiations and how negotiations unfolded, actually, it's had a very opposite effect. If you think about, you know, all the protests that have been in Germany and other countries, you know, if anything, what TTIP has done is fed fears of U.S. hegemony. I'm not saying these fears and these anti-American sentiments, if they're expressed, are often justified, because, of course, you know, the argument I would make is that with TTIP, it's about deregulation on, you know, on behalf of both European and U.S. businesses. You know, it certainly fed those concerns, and it certainly fed the concern that, you know, here are the Americans trying to ram down, you know, chlorinated chickens or beef-treated hormone down our throats. And it certainly doesn't help that this has coincided with the NSA spying scandal. So in terms of building trust, I think it's done quite the opposite. In terms of building trust between the European Union or European Union member states, and the US on a security footing, I mean, I don't think it addresses one of the fundamental issues there, which is that the Americans are sick of, I say in quotation marks, sick of free-riding Europeans, you know, Europeans not spending, in their views, enough on military defense. So, you know, actually, you know, those sorts of points of disagreement are going to, that point of disagreement in particular is going to remain. So actually, you know, TTIP has little to offer on both of those accounts, and actually may be a source of tension in the relationship.
Thank you very much. We have a question here.
I was going to make exactly the same point that Gabriel just made, which is I wanted to ask those against the motion how they think that TTIP is going to increase trust between Europe and the United States. It's having the opposite effect.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to jump to that. I actually think that, I'm not going to say we're at a point of no return, that we absolutely need to have an agreement. But actually, given this strong anti-Europe US sentiment, I am convinced that if we manage to build a good agreement, and then we can go and explain that to the public, and address those fears, that we can help rebuild trust. Something that we have been asking from the very beginning as industry is say, show us the early deliverables. As you go into these negotiations, give deliverables, be more transparent on some of the deliverables, so that we can go to the public and explain the benefits of TTIP to show that the concerns that have been raised. Data protection, privacy shields is one example. There has been this fear that, you know, the TTIP will be an opportunity to circumvent the data protection regulations in Europe. We were saying from the very beginning as industry, and it is included in the TPP text, I suggest you read the TPP text, that data flows should always comply with data protection rules. And we've said from the very beginning, don't be secret about this, negotiators. Just say it black on white immediately on a piece of paper. That's what it is. So a lot of the discussions we have had were unnecessary because they were created by the fact that, you know, there was at the beginning indeed a lack of transparency, and that, you know, there was no willingness from both sides to try and come up with deliverables so that they could go to the public and show, you see, I am not in this sector lowering your standards. The only thing that the public now has is they are feeding off leaks. Leaks and leaks and leaks. And, you know, the fact that negotiators go into public and they are not allowed to say everything, that obviously creates lots of mistrust. So I believe that if you can go into an honest debate with a document and show people that, you know, these concerns are addressed. Now, you're saying no. Well, there are obviously always people out there that you'll never convince. And in the debate, you have the the anti-globalists, you have the pro, and then you have folks that are in the middle there. And I think that those in the middle can be convinced.
Eric?
Yeah, to answer the question about the strategic aspect of it, I saw that Hans mentioned what is the definition of interest, and precisely, we gave a mandate to the European Commission for a trade agreement. And now we say that this trade negotiation, this trade agreement has to be part of a larger, broader context of EU-US transatlantic relations with a strategic impact. But I'm not sure the Europeans have defined themselves what would be their interest, what kind of economy they want. We know that we have like the Horizon 2020 for a new economy, but even for that, it's not clear what kind of program, what kind of horizon we really want to reach. You mentioned the Internet of Things, and all these nice projects. Of course, companies, the business sector is active in that, but I don't feel that the 28 have a common definition of their interest, of their strategy in terms of high technology, trade, even on agriculture, and all. So if we say it's good for the EU interest, there's nothing in the mandate saying that is what we want to achieve inside this trade agreement and inside the broader context of strategic relations and projection of European power on the world stage on the economic aspect. So we started a negotiation without knowing what we want to achieve and to with what goal we want to achieve it.
Marcin?
If you are asking about if TTIP will increase trust between the EU and the US, and if we see what is just now in a public debate, I share with you and with you that today we have a lot of emotions, noises, etc. That was the point I started. Because we simply do not have the end result. And we do not have an end text. And this is a way to give guidance to the both part of those negotiations to land properly. But I'm convinced that once this agreement is negotiated and once this agreement is implemented, then we will change from the phase of emotions and uncertainty to the tangible and countable results. And those flows of trade, or those flows of goods and those flows of services on both sides of Atlantic will increase trust at the end of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, so let me actually come back to that question of EU interest, which is a very, very interesting one. I think it's very clear what the interest behind TTIP is, right? This is clearly about, cutting NTBs, cutting red tape, increasing flows of goods and services across the Atlantic, and investment, of course. That's very clear, I think. But what's, of course, more debatable and contestable is what the EU interested in. And I think that's the whole point of democracy, that you have countervailing interests and fighting it out, for the vision of the good society or whatever it is. But if we subordinate everything to the interests of those who want to, cut red tape and boost trade investment flows, then of course what we're doing is we're stifling democracy in a sense. So, my point would be is that, there is no straightforward EU interest. But that what TTIP does is it subordinates it all to one interest, which is cutting red tape. There's another question I managed to read, and I think it was alluded to by Marcin in his presentation to kick off the debate, which is, is it not premature to have a debate on TTIP? And it's funny because this is precisely the question that the UK Trade and Investment Minister at the time asked me in a radio debate about a book I'd written about TTIP. He said, well, how can you find it a bit, ridiculous that you've written a book on TTIP when there's not even an agreement yet? Of course, there's no finalized agreement to be ratified by the the member states and the European Parliament, possibly the national parliaments. But I mean, that's the whole point. The whole point is that, you know, once we get to that stage, it's very late to change anything. Once we get to that point, we're faced with a fait accompli. Technically, the European Parliament and the national parliaments have no right to amend the text of the agreement. And so, you know, it becomes a question of, well, do you want to sort of give up on these goodies in terms of market access for the sake of regulatory policy space? And so, you know, it's important to participate in the debate now, particularly because we can already see the outlines of the deal. You know, in fairness to the Commission, yes, they've released more text, negotiating text than they have ever. Not the consolidated text of the agreement. We have to rely on TTIP leaks for that, and of course that's a couple of months old. But you know, I think there's enough indication of the direction of travel for us to be, you know, critical of the agreement and try and shape the content of the negotiations at this stage. Because if we wait until the agreement is released, then we're faced with a fait accompli.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? Then I go back to some of the questions here. There's an interesting question about the democratic support for the EU. And the question is, will TTIP help addressing the decreasing democratic support for the EU? Can you make a case for or against? We start with you, Gabriel.
Yeah, so I mean, talking from personal experience, as you can imagine, I do talk to a lot of anti-TTIP activists. The anti-TTIP movement, certainly in Britain, where this is perhaps most relevant, is divided over whether, you know, we should Brexit because of TTIP or whether we should remain because of TTIP. My view, of course, is that exiting the European Union is going to make the situation worse, because I think the UK government would negotiate a worse trade agreement with the United States. Moreover, I think Britain will have continued access to the single market, so will be hit by the deregulatory effect of TTIP anyway, even if it leaves. But I think, you know, something like TTIP makes my job as someone who would urge British voters to vote for Remain more difficult. I think it actually decreases trust in European institutions. Yeah, I think actually it's very problematic in that respect. People in the UK are afraid that TTIP and the European Union are trying to privatize the healthcare service. But it's actually their own government that's doing so and trying to enshrine it in TTIP. So actually, I think it undermines support in the European project, certainly in the UK. And I think also, you know, it's coloured with Euroscepticism in other places like Germany as well. So actually, I think it's having a rather deleterious effect there.
Thank you very much, Marcin.
I think we, as you by the way mentioned, think about the way of implementation of this agreement. We will have European Council to decide, we will have European Parliament to decide, and probably, as you said, we will have also ratification, because that will be probably judged as a mixed agreement. We will have probably the decision to be made by national parliaments as a national ratification process or processes. So today's very high emotional debate in Europe, probably in the US also, but I am not following that, is very important for negotiators, because then they can understand how they have to navigate those negotiations to be quite sure that that will be passed by the Council. Probably not extremely difficult. How that will be passed by European Parliament, probably not extremely difficult. But how to have 28 ratification combined, as a 28 national ratification combined, and that is a security for interested parties, that this agreement will have enough quality, because we'll need to pass those 28 procedures.
I think that question, it's too late to ask it, because I mean, when we look at the reactions to the fact that the mandate was not completely public, when we look at the reactions to the Greenpeace leaks, to the demonstrations in Germany when Obama visited Germany, some public statements of leaders like French President Hollande or Sigmar Gabriel in Germany, that means that the action to win public support has failed already. So it's too late to ask this question, because whatever happens, even if the agreement is concluded, there will be a big part of public opinion saying that it's not in the interest and that was pursued despite public opposition. And so in that, I think that this struggle is already lost. But on the other hand, maybe it's too early to ask the question. First, because the agreement is not concluded yet, so we don't know exactly what will be in it, and then we don't know how it will be implemented. And maybe in 5, 10, 15 years, we will see that it was beneficial to Europe and that public support will be there. But in the short term, it is going to increase the gap between the EU, the bureaucracy as it is seen, some governments, and public opinion, because public opinion is already negative towards TTIP.
Thank you very much, Nicolas.
Yeah, actually, I don't disagree on that. First, just to public opinion, when you look at the polls around Europe, you will still find countries where public opinion is in favor. So fortunately, there are still countries out there where public opinion is in favor. But I agree. The European Commission, the member states, the business community have embarked themselves on this project and all have underestimated the impact it would have in civil society and the upcry, etc. And nobody was ready to address that. Now, usually it's not, we as business, we don't, don't have to address that. It's for the leaders, the political leaders and the European Commission to do that. And it is correct that they have not done a very good job at first. And they are now trying to catch up. And I would argue that actually the European Commission is not getting the support it should from the member states and from the governments. Because, the Commission is out there trying to fight for this, but it is not getting all the support that it can. So I would actually agree that what we are seeing today is not good for the democratic support for the EU. But I am hopeful to what you said, that once it is agreed, and that's why I make the point again of we should have been working on deliverables, so that every couple of months we could have gone out to the public and show something. But okay, is that once it is agreed, we can have a different type of debate, because we can actually show facts. It will put the Commission, the member states in a different position, but it will require strong leadership from the member states, from the governments. They will have to stand behind this. So I think the idea of President Juncker to go back to the Council at the end of this month is an interesting one. It will give us business an opportunity to again show that we are not in here looking for lowering of standards. It will be a different debate. Will we win the debate? That's a different story. But at least it will give us an opportunity to have a different debate. And as I said, when you do the polls, there are some countries where it's challenging, if I can say that, but there are still a lot of countries out there where it's it's still quite positive. So I would say that it's not lost. It can help the it can support the legitimacy of the EU, but as it stands today, it's definitely doing the contrary.
Let me ask you a short question. One of the issues that has been on the table ever since the beginning was the question of transparency. And some of you have mentioned it, but it was not addressed by all of you in the same way. Can you please tell me, the opponents and the supporters, whether you believe that the process of negotiation of the TTIP process is transparent enough or not transparent? Gabriel.
Yeah. So, let's start from the beginning, right? So, the traditional argument when it comes to trade negotiations is that, in the process of trading concessions over tariffs, but also other traditional market access issues, you have to keep the deal secret because there's all sorts of trade-offs, and you don't want to end up, pissing off one group until the final deal is arranged, right? Until you can mobilize the supporters that gain from that particular trade-off. But of course, with TTIP, although there's some tariff issues, the main concern is regulation, right, and the impact that the agreement will have on regulation. So, I think that argument doesn't hold, and I think the Commission has realised that actually it's shooting itself in the foot by not being more transparent, because, of course, that feeds sort of some of the more outlandish criticisms about TTIP. TTIP is the end of democracy itself, which is not to say that it isn't a threat to democracy, as I've argued. So my point here would be that the Commission has taken a few steps. So concretely what it's done is it's released its negotiating position in a lot of the areas of the talks. It hasn't formally released its tariff or services offer, although the services offer, one version was leaked a year or two ago. The United States, of course, hasn't released very much at all. It has this very closed advisory system whereby, members of these advisory groups get to see the text and comment on them, but sign non-disclosure agreements, quite punitive ones at that. So what I would say here is this. I think actually the Commission needs to do a lot more. It needs to certainly push the United States to release their proposals and release the consolidated texts. We have some of the consolidated texts, which are texts where the EU and US proposals are put together, thanks to TTIP leaks. But those are, A, I don't think all of the consolidated text, and B, I think it's a few months out of date. And moreover, I think there's some rumors that the Commission has been deliberately moving towards consolidated text. A, because then it allows it to say, oh, well, we have texts in these areas, even though not much has been agreed necessarily. And B, because then it's not subject to its transparency initiative, because it's in the consolidated text. So it can claim, well, we would violate the trust of our negotiating partner if we release this document. So, to cut a long story short, I don't think there's enough transparency. There's been some positive moves, but a lot more needs to be done.
Marcin? Enough of transparency? Not enough of transparency?
I personally feel comfortable with the transparency with this agreement. In the EU, we have procedures how mandate of negotiators is defined and how the Commission is managing to obtain a negotiating mandate. And it is equal for this agreement and other agreements as well. So that was not, the procedures were never criticized. So we have a rule how to establish negotiating mandate, first. And it is done. Second, we have those big emotions linked with this Greenpeace leak. But it is a text which is leaked and probably do not answer for how the actual negotiations look like. Second. And the third, let's take the example of the biggest agreement from a few months ago, the Paris Climate Agreement. When actually the real text of the agreement was public, was on the table. That was actually few minutes before the conclusion. And that was adopted by 194 countries by unanimity. So negotiators are hearing voices, positive and negative. Particularly they are hearing negative voices because they know then they need to obtain an agreement that way or another, for instance with the ratification process. So I personally feel enough comfortable with the transparency of those negotiations.
Thank you very much, Eric.
I think the controversy about the transparency just shows that the Commission, the EU Commission, is always fighting the last war. Because the mandate was not public, because it's the way it is. But then you have the civil society, NGOs, very organized groups saying, oh, that should be public, they are hiding something. So they try to explain that while negotiating. And then we had the Greenpeace leaks. And then the Commission came forward and quite quickly reacted, saying, oh, that's an old, that's a state of play of previous round, it's not the state of the discussions right now, but the harm was made already. And so what we see is that the Commission and also there was this very harming image of MEPs having to go to a protected room to look at the mandate and the documents. And in Germany, they had to open a specific office so MPs can go and check the documents as well. So it's making public, it's creating the image of an institution that has something to hide, which is the worst thing you can do when you try to negotiate something which is meant to be beneficial to the EU and the citizens and the economies. So it's mainly communication, but it shows that there is no political sense, no feeling of what is going on, and then you can legitimately you can ask, okay, this commission which is not able to handle correctly the communication towards the citizen, how is it able to handle the negotiation itself?
Just maybe just one sentence. I fully share what you are saying. It is much more about the communication than something more. And with whole due respect for the general public, I think the general public is not understanding texts of international agreements, particularly trade agreements which are technical. So making it public we will have quite similar situation because will be very mixed sentences and mixed feelings because one man is understanding one thing, another something else, which is, by the way, not exactly what is in the text.
Yeah, I think just very shortly. I'm very comfortable with the level of transparency. Could it be more? Yes, it could be. But I'm comfortable with it also because, to Martin's point, there is going to be ample discussions and opportunities afterwards for public, for the parliaments, etc., to then debate this, and any concerns that are being raised today because of a fear of lack of transparency, we will then be able to address that later. The one thing where I do agree with Gabriel is that I think what we should have done is there are certain elements of a trade negotiation that have to be secret because of the nature, and then there are certain elements that by keeping it secret it feeds. And the regulatory cooperation is that. And I do believe that on regulatory cooperation, on the sectoral discussions, the mutual equivalence, etc., there should have been some more transparency because regulatory cooperation should not be about negotiation. Either a regulation is functionally equivalent, mutually recognizable, or it's not. And you should not be negotiating one regulation in the other. It's different on tariffs, it's different on public procurement, it's different on all of that, on services, etc. But on rules, either they are the same or they are not. And you are indeed feeding this belief that you are negotiating one rule over the other by not having more transparency on regulatory cooperation. But again, in the end of the day, I don't think it's against the interest of the EU because we will see a result that can then be debated and the negotiators know that they have to negotiate something that can be sold to the parliaments.
Thank you very much. Last question.
Sort of a bit of a comment, actually. I wanted to come back to this question of whether you can win this argument after TTIP has been agreed and after it kicks in and you can show benefits. Apart from the fact that, I agree with Gabriel that this is, the benefits are actually minuscule and they're over a 10-year period, and actually it's you're going to have to wait for a very long time, actually. But even apart from that, I think you're missing a bigger picture here, which is that there's a massive backlash going on against free trade around the world.
No, I know.
In the US, in Europe. And what keeps happening, and it's happening again in this debate, is that we know that the benefits of free trade are dispersed and the costs of free trade are concentrated. And so what happens is people are getting angry because they're experiencing the costs to them personally. And what happens is people like us just keep reiterating that there's a net benefit from free trade. And this is actually making the problem worse by strengthening this point, to come back to the point that Eric made, that actually elites are completely out of touch with ordinary people.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. Can we have the results of the polls on the screen, please? Okay, I will give each of the panelists...
Martin.
No, it's not over. No.
Why was the poll closed for a few minutes? I mean, quite long minutes. I couldn't vote.
I don't know why it was not there. It should have been there.
The original intent was to have a first poll, essentially after the first, before, they were all supposed to explain their point. Then you were supposed to vote. Then it was supposed to be closed, and another poll was supposed to be created to essentially have like a start poll of your initial thoughts on it, and then your thoughts after the debate. However, there has been a misunderstanding between me and my supervisor, so that's the only reason.
It would have been good to know that in advance.
Yes, I'm saying there's been a miscommunication.
So this is from before.
I was also surprised. Now, let's give half a minute to each of the panelists to make your case, and maybe we will change the results.
I'll blame the technical mishap rather than any misargumentation. I would come back to this issue of that's been repeated, that TTIP, we'll get a chance at the end when it's done to have a very transparent and open debate about it. I mean, if we look at, for example, the case of CETA, what you see is enormous pressure to not vote down an agreement that's going to bring growth and jobs, that's a good agreement because of a few market access gains, being brought to bear against European parliamentarians who have basically accepted or seem to be accepting a very, very cosmetic and soft-touch reform of ISDS, right? So on ISDS, the fundamentals haven't changed. It's still a mechanism that can only be used by foreign investors to sue governments for their public policy. So all the sort of objections that were being raised in the past, I think, are still valid. And yet, a lot of the members of the S&D group, the Socialists and Democrats group, the Social Democrats in the European Parliament seem to have, shifted their opinion. And a lot of, there's a lot of pressure being brought to bear when you have a trade agreement that's already been negotiated. You don't want to be called anti-growth. You don't want to be called anti-jobs. You don't want to be called an anti-globalist. So I think it's important before we get to that stage to have a proper debate. And I think with TTIP we've already seen that what's on the table is something quite problematic. It's all about cutting red tape, and it's not really about high standards.
Marcin, 30 seconds, please.
I think we need to think where Europe is today. And in my understanding, Europe is too much protectionist and too much closed and too much linked with the old privileges, which is not sticking to today's reality. And an open trade and competition is the only way for Europe to survive. The best way to unite with another big trade partner is to unite with the OECD member, where we have rules of law and similar set of values. So that's why TTIP EU-US agreement is a very important potential engine for EU recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric?
TTIP is an idea of an agreement based on theoretical benefits with promises we are not sure to fulfill because the agreement is becoming less ambitious between two partners who realize they don't have the same vision of what they want to achieve, and amid a growing lack of trust from the public opinion. And with a calendar that everyone wants to be very narrow and tight. So I don't see what kind of interest can come out of that.
Thank you very much. Nicolas?
But I'm very optimistic in the process that is going on in that, the European Commission knows that that there is a risk that this can be voted down in one parliament, and that's why it's taking all of the risks it is doing today to be as transparent as possible and to take on board what civil society is saying. He could have easily also said, if at the end of the day it's indeed as easy as you say, then it would not be doing what it is currently doing. We're talking about trade which will lower tariffs for goods exported from the EU to the US and make them more competitive, lowering tariffs on goods coming from the US to the EU, which will make consumer products cheaper and give an opportunity to businesses in the EU to have regulatory cooperation in such a way that when they export to the US, they won't have to do double testing, double certification, or adapt to different standards. From my perspective, that's a good deal, and that's good for business, and it's good for jobs and growth.
Okay, thank you very much. When I look at the results, is TTIP or TTIP contrary to EU interest? No, 70%, yes, 30%. So congratulations to the one who defended the notion that the TTIP is not contrary, but to the benefit of the EU. And thank you for making all the arguments. Thank you for interesting debate. I think
That
this
was
is
not
the
fair.
kind of debate that we have to have on such important issues more often and more broadly, especially with the public. Thanks to you, thanks to the organizers, and let us give big hands to our panelists. Thanks.